I'm a member of a denomination called the Anglican Catholic Church. It is one of the continuing Anglican jurisdictions that traces its founding back to a split from the Episcopal Church in the 1970s. We left primarily because of the unbiblical decision made by the Episcopal Church to place women in ordained offices. As continuing Anglicans, we hold fast to the teachings of Scripture and tradition against the liberalism of the modern age. According to Redeemed Zoomer, separating from a body that was departing from the faith once delivered to form a healthier one makes my church schismatic. His standard is that unless you've been formally excommunicated, or you're facing violent persecution, leaving your church is a sin. According to Redeem Zoomer, even if your church engages in heretical or false teaching, denies the resurrection, openly promotes homosexuality, abortion, or ignores their own confessions, it is not grounds for separation. Redeem Zoomer's standard is one that demands submission to falsehood, corruption, and sin. So today I want to take his standard seriously and hold it up against my own church's actual history. Does it stand? Let's find out. Welcome to the Reformed Catholic, where we look at theology and the Bible through a Reformed Catholic lens. And today we're going to be examining Redeemed Zoomer's criterion for a schismatic church. Redeemed Zoomer, who is a PC USA, that is a liberal mainline Presbyterian church, and runs Operation Reconquista, which is involved with calling conservative Christians and their denominations to return to the liberal mainline denominations that liberals took over, has been consistent. He said he stay in a mainline congregation that denied Christ's bodily resurrection rather than leave it if it was the only option nearby. His standard for justified departure is narrow: formal excommunication or violent persecution. Doctrinal collapse on its own doesn't count. He's called groups like the PCA, OPC, and ACNA schismatic on exactly this basis, and by extension, that's the charge against my church, too. So the question for today is, does that standard survive scrutiny with what actually happened to the ACC? From here on, every example will be measured against that same rule. Only formal excommunication or violent persecution justifies departure. Let me start by walking through the history that led to my church departing from the Episcopal Church. In 1976, the Episcopal Church's General Convention approved the ordination of women to the priesthood and the episcopate. Around the same time, the church was moving through a multi-year process to replace the 1928 Book of Common Prayer with a new 1979 edition. For the Anglican Catholics who go on to found my tradition, these weren't simply administrative housekeeping items. We understood them as changes to apostolic order and to the church's received worship. In September 1977, nearly 2,000 people gathered in St. Louis, Missouri, for what became known as the Congress of St. Louis. Out of that meeting came the affirmation of St. Louis, the founding document of the continuing Anglican movement, and the reason that the ACC exists. And here's the key move in that document, and it's one I still stand behind today. It doesn't describe itself as, we don't describe the ACC as a breakaway denomination. It describes the Episcopal Church's own governing councils as having acted unlawfully as having departed from the Christian faith themselves. We claimed to be the ones staying put and continuing from the original church, hence the name, continuing Anglicans. Though technically we were the ones who left the formal institutional church for a doctrinally purer church. So we must make a clear distinction between two concepts, legal and institutional continuity versus doctrinal continuity. This is going to matter a lot in a minute. This is where Redeemed Zoomer's framework runs into trouble, at least as applies to the ACC. His model effectively treats institutional continuity as if it were doctrinal continuity. If you're the one who stays inside the legal structure, you're faithful remnant. If you leave, you're the schismatic. Regardless of what the institution itself has done. This doesn't simply apply to my church alone either. This radical framework Redeemed Zoomer has created is being applied to other denominations as well. And I reject his argument directly, and so did the founders of my church. Our claim is that a council can act lawlessly in matters of doctrine, even while remaining the institutionally recognized body. When that happens, staying inside the structure isn't loyalty to the church, it's loyalty to a building, a legal entity, and a failed church that no longer honors its former theological commitments. You don't need to agree with our theology of holy orders to recognize this is a genuine disagreement about the nature of the church. Here's where it gets interesting, because Redeemed Zoomer has already been pressed on his faulty framework in a debate with Doug Wilson. Let's take a look.
What about the Methodists?
Yeah, good question. I thought you were going to ask that. So the British Methodists were absolutely schismatic. In America, the Methodist Episcopal Church was just a reconstruction of Anglicanism after the Church of England yoinked away all bishops and jurisdiction from the Anglicans in America to punish them for the Revolutionary War. So they had no bishops in America, but as we know, Anglicans and all Protestants have believed in national churches. So nobody questioned that there should be a Church of America after the Revolutionary War, distinct from the Church of England. Problem is, the Anglicans had no bishops. The Church of England yoinked them all away. So what Wesley did was ordained 2 bishops for the Church of America. Problem is, he wasn't a bishop himself. So some people considered that valid and some people didn't, and that's why you have the Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church. The Methodist Church never made a formal separation from the Episcopal Church. The Methodist Church in England absolutely did do that, which is why they're schismatic.
Right. So is the Methodist Church not schismatic because they never made a formal separation?
The Methodist Church didn't separate from anyone.
Well, there's an ocean there.
Yes, they made a geographical separation by getting on a boat. I mean, they didn't make an ecclesiological separation.
So I can separate from a church because I got a job in another city, but I can't separate from a church because
if a new island pops up in the ocean and you move there, then you can start a new church. That has always been the standard ecclesiology of the Church Fathers and the Reformers, is one church per nation.
Right.
Wilson got under Redeemed Zoomer's own model. British Methodists are schismatics because they broke away from the Church of England, but American Methodists aren't schismatics because they were never directly under the Church of England's jurisdiction to begin with. Consider the implications of this. Same movement, theology, and historical roots exist, yet whether a congregation is considered schismatic hinges solely on its geographical location within the Atlantic. This is not a principled ecclesiological criterion. Rather, it's a jurisdictional technicality masquerading as a moral judgment. Let's apply the same test to his own denomination, the radically liberal Presbyterian Church, USA. J. Gretchen Machen was a minister and professor of New Testament at Princeton Seminary. In the 1930s, he publicly opposed modernist theology infiltrating both institutions. And his immediate concern was how this liberalization was impacting Presbyterian missions work. For defending his church's historic doctrinal standards, he was suspended from ministry entirely. Rather than submit to the false charges, he left the mainline liberal and Presbyterian Church and helped found the conservative Orthodox Presbyterian Church, as well as Westminster Theological Seminary. Under Redeemed Zoomer's extremely flawed framework, Machen cannot justify creating a new denomination, but must remain in one committed to falsehood. Remarkably, he finds support for his claim based through word fallacies. To redeem Zoomer, unlike Martin Luther, who was excommunicated, Machen was only suspended and thus had no justification for his actions. In Redeem Zoomer's world, victims are the perpetrators. In his world, those abused by the church should subject to his persecution and harm for the sake of institutional disharmony. In his world, those who defend the teachings of the apostles once delivered are schismatic, while those who promote departure from the faith are to remain your overlords. This faulty logic was, in fact, one of the very reasons for the Protestant Reformation. He effectively rejects the Protestant Reformation core argument. Sit with what that actually means. Whether your departure counts as righteous resistance or as sin isn't about what you did or why you left or whether the church you left was actually teaching heresy. It's about which disciplinary label the body you're accused of resisting decided to slap on you. A choice that belongs entirely to them, not to you. I'm not sure his argument to attack the victim mentality fits well under his radically liberalized, pro-abortion, failing church. Redeemed Zoomer also likes to invoke Athanasius, who was a leading architect and the most prominent defender of the Trinity in the early church. He argues that since Athanasius historically didn't split off and start his own church, when the majority of bishops followed the Arian heresy in the 4th century, neither should modern Christians when their churches follow heretical beliefs. But let's look closer at what Athanasius actually did. He did not found a permanent parallel jurisdiction or church. He was repeatedly deposed and exiled for defending the church against heretics. Yet he continued to serve the church in parallel structures. The Anglican continuing churches found lasting parallel structures as well. Though rejected, the Anglican continuing community continues to defend the gospel once delivered, even as its former parent departed from it. The analogy, therefore, does not prove that 1977 was identical to the 4th century, but it does show that the claim Athanasius stayed inside the historic structure, therefore you must too, is fallacious. When the historic structure itself is controlled by those who deny the faith, the historic response has included functioning outside that structure. Whether the continuing Anglican Church did so wisely or successfully is a separate question. The mere fact of operating outside the legal body is not, by itself, a decisive mark of schism. St. Ambrose of Milan makes the principle even more direct. In his commentary on Luke, he writes, You must first make careful inquiry as to whether a church is of the true faith. If Christ dwells in it, you need have no hesitation in choosing it. However, if the congregation is of bad faith, or a heretical teacher disfigures the place, you must not have communion with these heretics and should shun their gathering. He must also abandon every church that rejects the faith and does not possess the foundations of the apostolic preaching for fear of being spattered and stained by an erroneous faith. The apostle says quite plainly, after a single warning, avoid the heretic. Ambrose does not say, wait until you are formally excommunicated, or endure until the violence forces you out. He says that once a church has rejected the faith and lost the foundations of the apostolic preaching, you must abandon it. That is precisely the judgment the continuing Anglican Church has made about the Episcopal Church in 1977. Whatever one thinks of their specific theological conclusions, the principles they were applying are not a modern innovation. It is the explicit counsel of a father of the church. So, where does that leave us? Redeemed Zoomer's standard, excommunication or violent persecution, puts the moral verdict on a departure in the hands of the very authority you're accused of resisting, as the Luther-Machen comparison shows. It makes British and American Methodists get opposite verdicts for the same theological break, and it cannot distinguish its own founding logic from the logic of the very groups it condemns, mine included, without reducing the differences to pure tactics. None of this means that my church and the continuing Anglican churches got everything right. Our history since 1977 is a little messy, and I'll be the first to admit reasonable people can disagree about whether 1976 crossed a real doctrinal line or whether leaving was the wisest course, even if it was not schismatic. But you just left, therefore you're schismatics, is not an argument. It is a label doing the work an argument should be doing. And I don't think it holds up to the history of my church, let alone history of the Reformation his own Redeemed Zoomer's own tradition depends on, or to the explicit counsel of Saint Ambrose. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this content, please leave a like and subscribe. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you in the one true faith.